2018, he succeeded in getting the California Democratic Party platform amended to include a timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan, an end to airstrikes, and the cutoff for further appropriations except those necessary for a safe and orderly withdrawal. Among his most ambitious policy proposals is a Marshall Plan for Central America. I think I'm not going to go through the whole thing because he has some information, just kind of repeats a lot of this, and I'm going to let him take over then, so I can get out of his limelight. So welcome, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. So I'm at this one, right? I'm at the right one?
Whatever.
Oh, okay.
They're both good. Yeah, that's okay.
All right. Okay, good morning after a fashion. I say after a fashion because I know I saw some of you at the demonstration yesterday, and we're starting a new war for a new year, it appears, and it's all quite depressing. One is always speaking about the last crisis because they've started a new one on you, and I am in a sense speaking about a recent crisis which has receded somewhat from the headlines because they've made even worse headlines. And I just want to acknowledge how difficult and how depressing all of this is to start. But we have no choice but to attempt to proceed on. Foreign policy, I call it the final frontier. And actually, before I go, I will mention an upcoming event in which a number of us are going to speak on that, including Reese Ehrlich, who has spoken to this group fairly recently. That'll be later this month. When I think of foreign policy in general, I think about it in terms of comparison to environmental issues. If someone were to tell you that they didn't think there was any real need to change our energy policies, our energy usage, from how we did it 50 years ago, even 20, 30 years ago, you'd say that person was a troglodyte, that person was a dinosaur, that person was ridiculous. Everyone knows that there have to be big changes there. Even people probably who think that the climate crisis is not man-made recognize that changes have to be made. However, if you say that you don't think there need to be real big changes in our foreign policy from how we did it 20 years ago or so, what do they call you? A statesman. They call you a foreign policy expert. There is little to no awareness of the level of change that we're going to have to undergo in American foreign policy, the way there is at least awareness of the need for a change in energy policy. We need the foreign policy equivalent of the Green New Deal. And in a sense, my topic today is a thought for a piece of something like that. The Marshall Plan, the idea of a Marshall Plan for Central America. Just to review, I think most people have at least a fuzzy idea from their high school history or what have you of the original Marshall Plan. It was a massive foreign aid program, about $100 billion in today's dollars, dedicated to rebuilding Europe after World War II. And it came about because of unusual circumstances. And what I mean by that is that forces in the country that normally would not be supportive of that level of foreign aid now were. There was, on the one hand, the people who would always be supportive of such things. The damage to Europe was obvious and immense. There were people who felt that we ought to aid those countries for humanitarian reasons. Those people are always in that camp. The difference was that the business community, the foreign policy community, was also in that camp, and in ways that they are not usually, certainly not always. The business community, and we got to understand, when we do foreign aid, it's often quite beneficial to the American business community because the products that are bought, our dollars are spent on are generally made by American companies. And so there was some interest there, and above all, you had the interest in combating communism. That is a big part of what the Marshall Plan was about. It was to exert American political influence in Europe. And as a result, all of these things combined for a level of foreign aid that's not really been seen since that time. And this country, as some of you I'm sure know, is known for being relatively stingy on the foreign aid front compared to many other relatively wealthy countries who devote a significantly higher portion of their overall budget to foreign aid. Okay. So now, Central America, why come up with this idea? And let me say, if this sounds familiar to you, I do not claim to have invented this idea. In fact, Julian Castro, who was a presidential candidate until this past week, raised the question of a Central American Marshall Plan in at least one of the debates. And I couldn't tell you what level of detail he had in mind, what his specifics were, but it's been out there. It came to my mind, I guess, from a book by David Bacon, who some of you probably know personally, and he's certainly spoken, like anybody I can name locally, he's spoken in this building to one group or another. And David Bacon wrote a book a few years back called The Right to Stay Home. And what that was about was Mexican migration to the United States that was caused largely by NAFTA, and by NAFTA enabling cheap American corn to flood into Mexico and destroy the farming lives of many, many Mexicans who no longer could compete with the massive American factory farming, and we're starting to try and drift north. And what he was talking about was the right not to migrate. And he says in the book, you know, there's been discussion about what are the rights of immigrants to this country, and that's all well and good. But we ought to talk about the idea that people should not have to migrate. And that they would probably rather stay home. And that was the impetus for my thinking about it in terms of Central America. You look at those pictures that were on the front page of the papers, well, they look drowned child, and so forth. And you ask yourself, why do people do this? And secondarily, if you think further, is there something that we could do that would make people think that staying at home was a better option than risking their lives, probably spending most of their savings and some of their future earnings if and when they safely arrive in this country? Is there a way to reverse that situation? So let's look at where the people are coming from and maybe a little bit of why. I think, again, people in this room know that the overwhelming majority of people who were seeking asylum at the border were from 3 Central American countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And interestingly, they were not from Nicaragua. And I say interesting because, of course, Nicaragua is the country that is reviled in Washington for its oppressive society, its denial of human rights. And in fact, you know, we funded the Contras against them. And for whatever reason, and I will go into it slightly, that's not where people are fleeing. They're fleeing these 3 countries. And why are they fleeing? Again, I'm not going to pretend to have a comprehensive analysis of what exactly is in the mind of each and every or most refugees, but as opposed to the economic situation that was driving the refugees that David Bacon was speaking about from Mexico, it would appear that violence at home is the major factor. And what are we speaking of in terms of violence? Well, there was a good deal of attention paid to Guatemala recently because they had a presidential election in which the winner had been associated with death squads. So violence in Guatemala came to the news. 16 environmental and land defenders were killed in Guatemala, the Times reported, making it the deadliest country in the world per capita for such activists. And the homicide rate for women is particularly high. It's more than 3 times the global average in Guatemala. It is 6 times the global average in El Salvador. It is 12 times the global average in Honduras. But as the Chief of Research and Trend Analysis of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime said, despite the risk associated with migration, it is still lower than the risk of being killed at home. That is how people view their lives in those countries. That is why they come. And as far as statistics go, in the last year that this was measured, the highest homicide rate in the world was El Salvador. The 3rd highest was Honduras. And the 9th highest was Guatemala. Each of them in the top 10. And again, as to Nicaragua, the rate in Nicaragua was less than the 3rd that of Guatemala, the lowest of the 3. It's not close. So whatever one wants to make of that, those are the facts as far as we know them. So that is, those are the numbers in terms of why people are coming here in the realm of personal violence. And I want to look for a moment at our history in this country. Because again, I think people are aware in this room that we have a long and not nice, not good history in those Central American countries. Guatemala was the one that first came to the attention of American people, to the extent that it was known among American people. The CIA engineered an overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. This is right around the time that we overthrew Mossadegh in Iran and started the situation that goes on to this day. And as the saying goes, in these countries, they never forget what the United States did to them. But in America, we never remember it. And in many cases, it's because we never knew it. Because the CIA did it sub rosa. But this is the story that they live with. We were involved in the wrong side of the civil wars in Guatemala subsequent to that. In El Salvador, we probably had our biggest intervention. We spent $4 billion on the wrong side of that civil war. That would be 8 to 10 billion today. That went on from 1980 to 1992. We also, we didn't realize, of course, at that point that the CIA had dropped 1.4 million, just million, that's small change, in intervening in a presidential election. You understand, of course, that that's considered a great crime in this country to intervene in another country's political election. If it's ours, we do it routinely. We've done it to those countries, barely worth notice. But if one wants to understand what is the history of those countries, the most recent intervention in those 3 was our support for the overthrow of a democratically elected president in Honduras, Manuel Zelaya. That just happened in 2009. And the other thing to remember is that the Contras were trained in Honduras. And did I not mention that the Bay of Pigs was organized in Guatemala? So this is our history. Now, does this, our participation in the violence and illegal activities of those 3 countries cause the level of violence today? I'm not sure. I'm not here to make a absolute argument that there is that is a direct cause and effect, but seems more than likely that our unfortunate history in those countries has a great deal to do with why we're seeing those people fleeing here today. Okay. So the idea of a Marshall Plan. Well, there's some interesting numbers here. At the last time that I looked, and I think it has probably changed, we were spending about $4 billion in border security. We were giving foreign aid to those three countries of about $140 million. So my thought is that if we reversed those numbers and started spending $4 billion on aid in those countries and only spending $140 million on border security, we might have a more sensible, reasonable approach to the problem. When I first wrote about this, someone immediately objected to it being called a Marshall Plan, because of Marshall, as again, some of you may remember from your high school history, as the Secretary of State in the U.S. after being the Commander-in-Chief of American Armed Forces. He has a major military career. So people objected to this. So if this were to ever come to pass, I would propose to be called the Romero Plan, after Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who was assassinated by some of the forces that we supported in the Civil War while he was saying Mass. Why could this happen, potentially? Why is it worth discussing? Well, I would say because we have a potential confluence of forces that might unite behind foreign aid for Central America that is similar to the situation, in some ways at least, that made the Marshall Plan possible in the first place. Which is this. Number one, there are people like the people in this room all around the country who would argue that we ought to be doing something to change the quality of life in those countries as reparations, almost. We have done so much damage to those countries that in a sense we owe it to them. Secondly, there are people who are not of a mind, the same mind as people in this room, who simply never want to see another refugee at our southern border. And if a program would keep them from appearing at the border, they might be for it. And it wouldn't be for reasons like people in this room would have. They would not normally be great supporters of foreign aid, but they might in this case. And then finally, the big thing is China, strangely. The Belt and Road Initiative. Who's familiar with this? Raise your hand if you are. A good half of the room, anyhow. Also called the Silk Road Program, which is not its official name. China has been on a major international diplomatic economic offensive for some time. This has been official for several years. They've actually already put $900 billion into this, much larger than the Marshall Plan was. They plan to put $8 trillion into it, spread over 65 countries. What is this? It's a massive development and redevelopment program. It helps various countries build dams, bridges, all sorts of infrastructure. Program is not without its controversial elements, of course. Some people, of course, think that it's really all about China just trying to increase its influence in the world, and God forbid that a country should get involved all around the world to try and increase their influence. They're shocked in Washington, shocked, I tell you, that this could be happening. But they are, of course, quite upset about this. There are people who say that it is a program that produces unsustainable debt in various countries, and I'm not here to argue that it isn't. Countries have backed out of it, but it is a major initiative. And the question of China on the world front worries them deeply in Washington. Those foreign policy experts who think we just got to keep doing what we keep doing because it's been so successful are very worried about that. You may recall in the last presidential debate, there was a question about how to approach China, and it went to Joe Biden, who said he'd take, I think, 60% of our fleet and put it in the Pacific Ocean, something like that. This is the standard response in Washington to the growing influence of China around the world, military, right? And why it even comes up in Central America is El Salvador actually just signed on to the Silk Road program. So they are now involved. A lot of this has to do with the politics of Taiwan and China. El Salvador signed on to it because they switched recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China, and Honduras and Guatemala still recognize Taiwan because they are so much in the shadow of the United States. We've discussed already the level of intervention that is possible and has happened. They haven't done it, but one now has. So they're fairly concerned about this sort of thing in Washington. So that really, I think, is the last piece of it. There is an argument to be made that some will even understand in Washington that you can't do everything by sending in the fleet. And that if you really are worried about China's growing influence in the world, that the path to opposing that or limiting that, if you're concerned with it, might be on seeing who can do more for the countries you're worried about going under China's influence. Now, when I suggest this idea, I don't suggest it, as I said before, because I think that, and this is really the point, I don't suggest it because I think the motives of everybody who would be behind a Romero plan are motives that I would endorse 100% or that people in this room would endorse 100%. But the nature of politics, really, the nature of major political change is when people with very different motives decide to agree on one action. If the result of a Romero plan for Central America were that companies I don't love made out well in it, given the options, I would certainly find that very much preferable to armament companies making out very well. And it's not just because they're armament companies, but because when you build those armaments and you spread them around, you gotta use them eventually to justify it, right? If we never did things like we did the other day in Iran, people would start getting the idea, we don't need all these weapons. That is the built-in problem. So it might, again, it might be corporations who we would not approve of, who would wind up moving into the breach as opposed to some of the armament corporations. But and do I really think, do we really think that a world in which the US is competing with China for influence globally is an ideal world? No. But it's a lot better world than one where they're doing it militarily. And that is, I think, what we are looking at as an option that could change somewhat the course of American foreign policy. I said in the beginning that I thought we needed a Green New Deal and foreign policy. And I offer this nugget that it's really just confined to 3 countries that are very close to us as an example of, I think, the type of foreign policy thinking we have to engage in. Because let's face it, all of you have been to anti-war demonstrations over and over again, I'm guessing. And we are always stuck in the position of reacting. We need to find a way to put out an alternative foreign policy that makes sense to people, that achieves in some way our goal of demilitarizing the world, of reducing violence in this world, because not just do we hate what it's all about, we need to get people to recognize that just as we cannot continue on an energy policy that's like the one we've had for years because the planet will not tolerate it, the same is true with the foreign policy and military policy that we have been engaged in for years. So, if this country wants to compete in the world, let it be a question of what they can create, not what they can destroy. So that's the idea behind it. I offer it to you as a nugget of food for thought and as a taste, I hope, of the type of thinking, the type of direction that we need to go in. So happy to take questions, comments, and I, of course, also understand that the events of the past week may be things that people wish to talk about. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so I'll bring the mic around. Okay.
I'm wondering if you could give us an example of the type of project.
Oh, it has to do with his